Now that we've played with that object a little bit more with the color effects, I'm going to take off that color effect so that I can go to the next thing. Actually, before I do that, let me go back to alpha just real quick. One thing that we're going to be going to next is the display modes. Now, the display modes are basically blending modes that these objects can use. And one of the most important ones that we might want to choose is the layer blending mode. And what that does is it chooses to calculate this object in a different way. It treats it as one solid object instead of separate stroke and fill. Now you'll notice when I take this back to normal, I can see the stroke and fill treated separately with alpha. You can see a very distinct change there. If I go back to the display mode and change it to layer, you'll see that the stroke and fill are now calculated as a solid object, and then the alpha is applied. So that can be very important. I'm going to go ahead and take those off to none, close down the color effect so I can see the display modes. Now, display modes are really fun to play with. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. And in order to really show them, you need to have an object that's on top of another one. So I'm going to go to Darken, and you'll see what Darken does is it uses the darker areas of the top object and calculates it onto the bottom object. If we do Multiply, you'll see how much darker that they get where they overlap. Lighten only takes the lighter areas. Screen makes it a lot brighter everywhere. Then we have things like Overlay, which sometimes enriches colors. Hard Light, Add, Subtract, and even Difference. Difference is a really helpful one that you'll see at another time. Notice when you have two colors that are exactly the same, such as this blue, well, it looks like orange here, but when this is typically blue, since that blue and the blue of this symbol are exactly the same, that's why we get black. And that's also why we get black where the overlap happens on the strokes as well. So anyway, display modes are a lot of fun to work with, but do be aware that they can cause some problems because they can slow down the rendering of your screen if you have a lot of them. The last thing to play with, just to show you that's there, are what are called filters. So one thing I want to point out with the display thing before we leave, though, is this button called Cache as Bitmap. What that does is it converts your object from a vector to a bitmap when you run your Flash file. So that's when you test it with something like Control-Enter or Control-Test-Movie. Now, we might not be able to tell, but this is actually a bitmap now instead of a vector like the other ones are here. And that's because sometimes it's important to have a bitmap. Now, how do you know when you're creating a bitmap? Just so happens that anytime that we apply filters, it will automatically convert this to a bitmap on the screen for us. So I wanted to play with those for a minute. In order to apply a filter, click on the New below Filters at the very bottom of the filters, and you'll see that we have drop shadows, blurs, glows, bevels, and then some of these others. Click on one of the effects, and you'll see that our settings are up here. So we can change the amount of blur, we can change the strength of that blur, we can change the quality, and I tend to use medium or high, and then we can change the distance. I often take it back to 0 so I can see that applied on all sides. Now, one of the things that's very important about this is that when I apply this particular filter, it does change this object. I'm going to zoom up a little bit so I get really close. May be hard for you to see here. It's actually very hard to tell. And it might be a difference between CS3 and CS4 too. But typically what we have here is a bitmap instead of a vector. And it's hard to tell, but anytime you apply any type of filter, it does convert your object from a vector form to a bitmap form. Now, there are other filters that you can apply with glows and whatever else, and it's a good thing for you to play with all the different ones, just so you get a feeling for how they apply. Now, if you want to add more filters, you definitely can. You can also you can move around your filters, so you can reorganize your filters. Save your work and we'll go on.